Tim, great to have you with us on the podcast. Mate, we're talking about your latest column, Posie Parker, Destiny Church and Policing Protest. There's a lot packed into that.
There's a lot to get into.
Yeah. So why don't we rip right into it? Over the past few years, from Posie Parker to recently Destiny Church, we've seen a lot of protests and counter-protests and a lot of friction between groups.
Yeah.
And you dig into that in the column. What is it that you're kind of getting at here with these protest, counter-protests?
Well, I want to look into the role of the police in this in this sort of landscape, and it's a volatile landscape. It is intensifying. There's no question about that. Interestingly, this was provoked initially by the IPCA, the Independent Police Complaints Authority's review of the Posie Parker protest, what happened there, and it sort of came out around the same time that Destiny Church invaded a drag king event on the science of rainbows at Te Atatū Library. Now, I'm not interested in litigating the rights and wrongs of the issues involved, but just what's happening with protest and how are the police able to deal with protest and counter-protest. And look, the IPCA are quite reasonable. They're saying, you know what, we didn't always do the best job we could have for a variety of reasons.
And it's not just those two events, but there were others involved where some people were arrested and they acknowledged, well, actually those arrests were
not lawful.
Yeah.
So there were a couple of arrests, and we've seen probably one of the heightened galvanizing factors for protest has been what's been happening in Gaza. So there were lots of pro-Palestinian protests. There were counter-protests to that, and those people were arrested. Now, in terms of just how that shakes out, you would think, well, maybe they were arrested because they were worried. The police were worried about the response of the protesters because it's a very visceral issue.
Yeah, so those people were standing on the sidelines, sort of holding a sign.
In one instance, I know that.
And the police moved them on by arresting them. And you could interpret that, if you're going to interpret it generously, as saying, well, the police were worried about this person's safety.
I think, but also worried about order.
Yes.
And I understand that is an issue. The police need to maintain safety. They also need to maintain order. But what's interesting is the IPCA has subsequently said that both arrests were unlawful. There's also another case, this is not detailed in the report, about a pro-life protester who held up had a board with $100 note tagged to it. It's like, how would you like to debate the rights and wrongs of abortion with me? Well, got into a debate with some strangers on Lambton Quay and was arrested by police for this. The Free Speech Union got involved and the charges were actually withdrawn last November. So there's a number of things happening here.
Yeah. And so the policing of these sort of things is kind of what you've interrogated in your column. And how does it shake out? The Complaints Authority said we got it wrong on several occasions. What are their recommendations? Are they asking for anything? Or?
Yeah, they want a Public Assemblies Act and also extended police powers. Now,
the radar goes off when you hear extended police powers a little bit.
Well, I think because what's interesting is you look overseas and there was a broadening of police powers in the UK that has resulted in, and this what's fascinating here is I guess if I can just pull back, I draw sort of moral equivalence between what I call the thug's veto, i.e. The effect that a larger and angrier, possibly more violent group can have on the free speech of a smaller, perhaps more peaceful group. And we looked at that, we saw that in Posie Parker, where at this event, Let Women Speak, there were hundreds of people there. Well, thousands showed up, demanding that the event not go ahead. As it happened, there was some violence. A 71-year-old woman was repeatedly punched in the face by a 20-something LGBTQ male activist. And so there was violence there. Police actually stopped the event because it was just getting, they felt it was getting out of hand. Now in the review, they say, we didn't have enough police on hand to cope with the situation. I sympathise because obviously police are under-resourced. They need to be able to, I guess, be able to assess what's at risk.
Yeah.
So I understand.
They're not just policing the protest. They've also got to continue their job of looking after wider, answering emergency calls and things like that. So they can't have all their officers down at Albert Park policing a protest.
No, they can't. And, they've got limited resources. Yeah. So the Public Assemblies Act, it's interesting actually just going out of the car, I don't mention this, but there's a variety of regimes around the world where you have to sign, if you want to have a public protest, you've got to register it with authorities beforehand. Now, some countries, for example, unsurprisingly, Singapore, you've got to register everything and the police are very active. A place like Switzerland, you register stuff, but the police have a lighter touch.
Oh, wow.
And other countries, you don't have to register, but they have a heavier touch.
Wow.
So there's a variety of regimes here. Well, I'm interested in the UK.
Yes.
Because police powers were extended, but there have been complaints by those who are on the political left, so people operating pro-Palestine protests, but also, and this is for some other laws that were passed earlier, for those who've been arrested for praying silently outside abortion clinics. So broadly, there's this, there's this sort of, I guess you could say, oh, well, if it affects the left and the right, that's fine. Well, no, what we want to do is affirm free speech. And to go back to what happened at Posie Parker and Destiny Church, I would argue that Destiny Church should probably have a different political position to the thousands of who had shown up saying that Posie Parker was quote unquote transphobic. However, they were both allowed, or they are both able to suppress the free speech of another, a smaller group, because of this thugs veto. I think we should be very, very careful when we give new powers to police, and also think about the legislative framework, that we don't empower the thugs veto for the sake of order.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a long...
No, that's good. So there's a lot in there. But the idea then would be that the police should have the powers to keep order, but also not...
Within reason.
Yeah, but then not to as well have not so much power that whoever threatens the most violence is able to take control of the conversation.
Whoever's the angriest, whoever threatens the most gets to win the day. We don't want that. That's not that doesn't allow a contest of ideas. Now, you could argue and say, well, protest is simply performative. They're not about contests of ideas. But I think, and this is something that that I quote in terms of just the behaviour at protests. There's this old-fashioned sort of Kiwi virtue of politeness, and I think we're losing that a bit. Russell Kirk, who is, by the way, not a Kiwi, but political thinker, quotes, men, and of course women, cannot improve a society by setting fire to it. They must seek out its old virtues and bring them back into the light. So I would hope that by resourcing police to be able to, I don't want to use the word empower, but you know what I mean, free speech, we will bring those virtues of civility back into the light, that sort of politeness. And it's an interesting phase we're going through as a country.
On the flip side of that, we were talking just before about the things that we might give up to maintain order. Is that something that concerns you? You mentioned that the protests are getting more intense. Yeah. There's an intensification. There's more combativeness.
Yeah.
People might look at that and go, well...
you know what? I'll make a sacrifice.
Yeah, and I'm happy to do that because I want some order.
And I think it is a danger for Kiwis.
Yeah.
Because I've said this before, but there is often a rush to consensus. And it's like, oh, well, we're not very good at disagreeing with...
We go along to get along, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I disagree. But...
How dare you?
Now we're talking. Now we're talking. I don't know if we need to develop sort of the cultural muscles to be able to disagree. So until we do that, though, there will be a natural, I think, and unfortunately, a natural cultural preference for suppressing disagreement for the sake of enforcing order. Now, I think if you suppress disagreement, it doesn't go away.
Yes.
It simply festers and reappears in a different light.
Yeah.
Well, no, not in a different light, but maybe in a different environment.
Yes.
And it can be worse.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do we strike that balance, Tim? Is there a way, do you see, or we just got to tread carefully?
Yeah, look, I think we need to ensure that, and I think the focus needs to be on free speech. So let's go back to basics here that I've highlighted with the column. Thugs veto cannot win. So any regime shouldn't enable thugs veto. That's got to be the first precept. The other is that as Kiwis, we try and stretch our muscles a bit and learn how to disagree, agree a bit.
I love it, Tim. It's a great column. Thanks for being with us on the podcast. You've given us lots to think about and talk about.
And tinker with.
Yeah, and tinker with. That's great. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Jason. More power, please, and a framework to use it. That's the summary of the Independent Police Complaints Authority's, IPCA, review of how the Thin Blue Line acted during the Let Women Speak event at Albert Park 2 years ago. You may remember the stoush. British activist Posie Parker was escorted from the park by police after counter-protesters surged forward, with one person pouring liquid on her. This occurred after thousands gathered to prevent her from addressing a crowd of hundreds, and they succeeded. It's laudable that the police protected her physically. They didn't exactly protect her freedom to speak. Parker believes that a woman is an adult human female, a stance that counter-protesters insisted was transphobic. While this debate is important, let's focus on some key takeaways. Numbers win. There were too few police on hand. Violence ensued. A 71-year-old woman was punched in the face by a 20-year-old male LGBTQ activist. Fast forward to Destiny Church's recent attempt to invade a drag king event in Auckland. A group numbering about 50 caused the 30 or so fearful attendees, including children, to barricade themselves inside the Te Atatū Library. Police came, but Destiny's mob shut the event down. Again, putting aside the rights and wrongs of the debate, the outcome was the same. Thugs veto won the day and everyone else lost. Thugs veto occurs when protesters, through sheer numbers or threat of violence, silence a smaller, often more peaceful group's right to free speech. Such reactions are clearly intensifying, and thuggishness shouldn't win. Russell Kirk notes, men cannot improve a society by setting fire to it. They must seek out its old virtues and bring them back into the light. There's this old Kiwi virtue called politeness. Realistically, police also recognise they need better responses. The IPCA assessed 2 other cases regarding people arrested for counter-protesting at pro-Palestinian events. Both arrests were later found to be unlawful. Police also arrested a pro-life advocate for engaging in a debate with strangers on Lambton Quay. The charges were withdrawn last November after the Free Speech Union took up the case. In the UK, police were given broad powers 2 years ago to move on protesters. Some states in Australia also have similar strictures. The IPCA is asking for a Public Assembly Act requiring notification of assemblies and extended police powers. Wisely, they're not seeking anything like the UK measures. But what's to prevent politicians thinking these would be a good idea anyway? Interestingly, those criticising the UK laws that stifle protest come from both the political left, supporters of pro-Palestine protests, as well as the right, arrested for praying outside abortion clinics. Surveying the cases involving Posie Parker, the pro-Israel and Life protests, and Destiny, the same could be argued here. The danger in all such instances is that police become the ones deciding who's allowed to speak and what speech is permitted. That's one thing they should never police. Let's resource them to protect free speech, not the thugs' veto.